Hey, all you remote learners out there, how are you today? So today we're going to be moving into section 2. And so today we're going to be focusing on who are those famous sociologists, what are their contributions to the field of sociology. Obviously, you're learning more about one of them individually as you're creating this fake book project, which don't forget is due Friday at midnight. And you've also got that famous sociologist worksheet to complete as well. And we'll be doing journal number 1 this week, but journals don't get turned in till the end of the quarter. So really and truly, when it comes to sociology, remember that it is really a modern field of study. Compared to the other social sciences like history, which has been studied for thousands of years because people were interested in learning about past events, or political science, right, where people have always taught others about how their government runs and what rights and responsibilities they have. Sociology is really a modern social science. It's only really come about because of the Industrial Revolution. So into the mid-1700s and then into the 1800s, you have the first and the second Industrial Revolution, where people are changing the way they live their lives. They're no longer, just growing crops. They're not just farmers. It's not agricultural based. They're moving to the big city to get jobs. And as many people move to the city to get a new way of life and to, kind of seek out adventure and have new job prospects, it leads to overcrowding. It leads to pollution. It leads to crime. So there's other kind of issues that are evolving. And so hence you now have a different type of society and social structure as people live in that territory. And you also have new social problems that didn't exist before. And so over time you see the creation of the field of sociology, and it's really created to deal with the social problems that people in that society are facing. And there's different perspectives about how to help people, how to show empathy and kind of trust and respect for others, and how to fix society's problems. Some people basically have the viewpoint that those problems are natural and perhaps they won't be fixed. Other people feel that those problems are occurring because of the conflicts in society, and yet again, they might be fixed, they might not. And some people are more interested in kind of the interactions among society as a whole. But we're going to be looking at some of these famous people today that have really kind of helped make the field of sociology what it is. So the first person to talk about is Auguste Comte. And Auguste Comte is the founder of sociology, the father of sociology. He's really living in France post-French Revolution, and it is a whirlwind in terms of changes. We see that there's changes in terms of government structure, the rights that people have, and then as France is going through the Industrial Revolution, people are no longer just living in small towns, they're no longer farmers, they're moving to cities. They're realizing that they can't afford the rent in the cities. The poor elements of society are forcing their wives to work or even their children to work. There's crime, there's pollution, there's violence. And so society really starts to be changing kind of at a whole new pace. And it's during this time period that he really kind of helps create this field of sociology and creates the word of sociology, and he really says that it's something that you shouldn't be taken for granted, that we need to have a further examination of our consciousness, of our society, of the problems that exist. And he really focuses on two key ideas: social statics versus social dynamics. When we're talking about social statics, we're talking about things that stay the same. And so he talks about how even as the Industrial Revolution has led to a change in the way their society is structured, because now you have urbanization, growth of cities, and with that you come crime and pollution. He says, however, maybe there's still nationalism. There's still love and pride for the French people. Maybe there's still marriage. There's still, people who are not getting along in their marriages, people who are happily getting along. Children are still being created. So the more things change, at the same point, things stay the same. And he kind of really focuses on cause and effect there. And he says the reason that things sometimes change are because there is a catalyst. There is a social dynamic or an event, a new type of technology, a war, an industrial revolution, something that happened that brought about these changes in society that's affecting people as a whole. So, looking at our world, in modern times, the pandemic is clear evidence of this. In terms of a social static, people are going to get married, and people are going to get married regardless of whether there is a pandemic or not. But the pandemic is the social dynamic. It has brought about this change. And so we've seen that some people have delayed their weddings in 2020, 2021. Some people have had smaller weddings. Some people have gotten married via Zoom. Some people have eloped. So basically, world events impact how people live their lives and what they feel is important and what they care about. Auguste Comte also writes a book called Positivism. And in his book where he's talking about positivism, he's basically saying that there needs to be science and there needs to be observation as you're coming to these conclusions. It can't just be opinion, it can't just be bias because everyone has their own perspective, and it has to be kind of a fact-finding mission, and you need to be really basing your observations about society based off true data. Sorry about that, I just hit pause for a second since the minute music came on. But really and truly, his book Positivism was all about this idea that, it's this philosophy of how the world works. It's his way of thinking, and he talks about, how our observations need to be based off of natural phenomena or basically observable facts. And so he kind of lays the groundwork as far as not just using bias when you come to your conclusions, but they need to be based off data. So he is really and truly the beginner of the field of sociology. We're also going to go through some other main important people in the field of sociology. So if the person you're doing your project on is not in this lecture, it's okay. They're important as well. It's just that they might be more modern, and they weren't kind of one of the early first sociologists. Harriet Martineau is one of the most famous early sociologists as well. She lives in England, and she translates Comte's book from French to English about the positive philosophy. And she really continues to focus on how people really need to, draw conclusions about society and social problems, the way the world works, not just based off their own bias or perspective, but she really focuses on objectivity. And so she starts thinking about how people perhaps might need to use science and conduct research to really come to their conclusions. And she really starts to propose that, you can talk about all these problems in our society, and that's great and all. It's important to realize that those issues exist, but also you need to start proposing, some changes. You need to start proposing solutions, to these problems so that we can make the world a better place. She was an advocate herself for ending slavery, for improving women's rights. And so she brought about kind of more information in England about these topics, but she didn't really bring about huge amounts of legislation to bring about those changes. But it was a step in the right direction, and it was really getting more about the rest of the world interested in sociology as a social science and starting to make people realize that we can talk about the problems our society has. That's not a bad thing, and we can work on changing them. Next big early sociologist to talk about is Herbert Spencer. And when we're talking about Herbert Spencer, we're talking about Auguste Comte. They fall under the functionalist perspective. And he was, yet again, from Great Britain. He was a sociologist. People also refer to him as a biologist, as a writer. He was great friends with Charles Darwin. And Darwin, of course, talks about evolution and, how species change over time and how they might have, certain traits or characteristics which make it possible, for one species to develop and survive compared to another. He takes this concept and he actually is the one who coins or comes up with the term survival of the fittest. A lot of people think that Darwin said that. It's actually Herbert Spencer. And he really kind of misapplies this concept of survival of the fittest to people, to society, to immigrants, to native peoples, and it becomes, unfortunately, the justification for everything. Survival of the fittest becomes an excuse for one group to commit imperialism, to conquer another. It eventually becomes kind of the basis for racism as to why it's okay to disrespect others because you feel that you're better than them. So it's not really a great thing. And he really kind of focuses on it when he's looking at our society and our social strata, meaning our social classes and the different groups of people. And he legitimately believed that some people were literally better than others, and it was okay. And as the world was going through these changes related to the Industrial Revolution, he justified the fact that, factory owners were paying their employees nothing. He's like, that's okay. He's like, that's social Darwinism in action. And he's like, these people who've risen to the top clearly are smart, they work hard, they own their factory, they should be allowed to pay their employees as much as they see fit. And if the individuals who work at that factory aren't paid enough, and if they die, so be it. That's social Darwinism. Pretty heartless, in today's society, thinking about things like student loans, welfare, the CARES Act related to COVID, small businesses closing, he would not be for any kind of government intervention or support. He would be against unemployment benefits, Social Security, student loans, welfare, stimulus checks from COVID. He would basically say people have to make it on their own, and if they don't, so be it. That's, survival of the fittest, that's evolution. And he was an interesting man who basically said that, society was going to work the way it was supposed to, that everybody had their specific role in society, and together it was a group of interrelated parts, and everybody had their specific role, and that honestly, yes, some things are static, like people have religious beliefs, but at times things are more dynamic, so kind of he was a follower of Comte. And he said, there would be civil unrest, there would be problems, there would be revolutions and war, there would be pandemics and plague. And he says that's natural. There's no reason to correct it. So he identified the social problems, but didn't really want to fix them per se. Next person to talk about is Karl Marx. He's probably someone you've heard about before. I hope so, because I mentioned him in U.S. history. He is honestly considered more of an economist than a sociologist. But we throw him in the field of sociology because he is also the creator of the conflict perspective. So we'll talk more about perspectives next class in our next section. But basically, people who are functionalists, are more optimists. They see the glass half full, and they think society has problems. They identify them. Most people want to fix them. Herbert Spencer's kind of in an unusual group. But they say that, problems are natural, they're normal, they're part of time, and there's perhaps not much you can maybe even do to fix them, but they'll try. Conflict perspectives focus on inequality and injustice, and they say that, conflict perhaps in some ways is normal, but for the most part it is not. That inequality needs to end. They want to see some kind of revolution or change occur. So in a way, it's a good thing because he wants to fix society's problems. But in Karl Marx's case, he was supportive of the use of violence to have this occur. Now, in his economic viewpoint, he is the supporter of Marxism or socialism, taken to the extreme communism. So when we're talking about wealth, right, we've got a capitalist system in America where people have the ability to open up their own business, to make money as they see fit. In a communist or a socialist country, the resources are shared. The government controls things. They tell you, they would control healthcare and education and major factories like steel and railroads. And they would tell you perhaps if you were in a communist country where you could work and where you couldn't. And there's a lot of control going on there. But at the same point, the benefit of a communist and socialist country is you're not going to see this huge gap between rich and poor. Everyone is going to be equal in terms of wealth. And Marx really talked about in his book, The Communist Manifesto, how society is divided between the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, the people who are the factory owners, and the proletariat, the factory workers. And he said, inequality will continue to exist. Revolution will happen. Those workers will overthrow the capitalists. And this imbalance will, basically rise up into violence. And it needs to come to an end. Everyone needs to be equal in a society where resources are shared. And in order for that to happen, you have to submit some of your free will and power to the government. So he is definitely an economist focusing how you can share, a scarce amount of resources. But ultimately, he's also a sociologist because he really focuses on the problems of society, the injustices, the inequality, and says, are we going to fix those problems and how? And so many people who are in the conflict perspective today who are studying issues in terms of race or gender or sexuality, in terms of gay rights, trans rights, they would all perhaps be, devoted followers of Marx in the conflict perspective. Next one to talk about here is Emile Durkheim. And Emile Durkheim is a Frenchman, and he is going to help create some of the first classes taught at the university level, taught at the college level, that focus on sociology. And he continues to believe that, just like Comte first suggested, and then Harriet Martineau who suggested, that people cannot just be using their observations, their, thoughts to come to a conclusion about society's problems and what solutions might exist. It needs to be based off hard data, We need to do experiments. We need to have case studies where you're watching someone for a long period of time. We need to be collecting this data and analyzing it. He's focused more on, the actual data and not just your own personal observations or feelings. And he's the first one to really do this statistical analysis of it all and is able to eventually include all that information in the classes he teaches at the university level that helps propagate the field of sociology, get people more interested in it. And some of his most famous experiments are on suicide. And it's interesting because, up until this point, when it came to something like suicide, it wasn't highly studied. Early on in history, a lot of people just, try to brush it aside, didn't talk about it, said it was wrong, it was immoral, it went against religious beliefs, things in that idea. There wasn't really a true focus on mental health and trying to help people or understand what was going on. Was there depression involved? What would lead them to that decision? And then in time, we are going to see the creation of psychology, right, where people are focusing on depression and mental health and what triggers led someone to commit suicide. Sociology doesn't really focus on suicide from an individual perspective because it looks at things from the group perspective. And Durkheim was looking at France in general, and he was saying, well, have suicides risen? Is that in reaction to poverty? Is that in reaction to a spread of a disease, to a war? Are there certain factors going on which would increase, a suicide level or decrease it? And we look at these factors today as well, not just with suicide, but we look at things like, more just depression in America. Obviously at this point in time, depression levels are up for teens, for adults, for, perhaps even children. And of course, now it's very easy to diagnose, okay, well, it's COVID, it's lack of social and emotional connection. But that's what sociologists do. They look at trends they see in society as a whole, and they try to pinpoint what's behind those trends and how can we solve them. So when it comes to school shootings are on the rise in America in the past couple of years. What's behind that? Is it cyberbullying? What is it? He, yet again, is a functionalist. He is focusing on how society is a set of different parts working together over time and how you need each part of that society to really make things run properly. So for example, you need a church system, because it gives people morals and hope and values. You need a police department, you need a school system, you need hospitals, you need to have some kind of family type activity center where friends and families can come together. So there are different parts that make everything kind of truly come together and work that are interconnected in our society. Function in general is just the consequence that an element of society has for the maintenance of the social system. So whatever we're talking about in our society, it has a specific role, it has a job to do, it helps connect people, okay, and really kind of relate to people. So schools, obviously, when it comes to education, there are certain functions that education has in America, right? It's to teach different job skills. It's to teach reading, writing, arithmetic skills. It's to teach social and emotional skills. It's to help prepare people for career in college. I think we could probably come up with a huge list of different skills or functions that education, helps you meet your friends, or perhaps help you meet, your favorite or your person you're going to marry one day. So there's different functions that one thing plays in our society that has all of these later consequences that perhaps you've not even realized. And that was some of the stuff that Durkheim actually studied as a functionalist. Next person to talk about here is Max Weber. Max Weber is not interested in society as a whole. He is interested in the individual groups in society. So he's interested in breaking it down. And really, he would be thinking about, okay, it's not so much about, is the suicide rate going up? Is the divorce rate going up or down? What's happening with people's mental health? He's just kind of interested in how groups get along or don't get along. So in terms of how are women's rights progressing? How are the rights of African Americans progressing? Or trans rights? What's happening in terms of relationships? Is domestic violence still occurring? So he's interested in it kind of at the micro level, kind of at the smaller interpersonal relationship level, but also at the macro level. And he's really just interested on the effects of society on the individual, not vice versa. So yet again, how would, women, start to work more over time? We've seen that change in terms of the women's revolution. How would that impact family structure, dating patterns, things like that. What kind of impact is it going to have on someone's life? He is very famous because he talks about verstehen, how important it is to have empathy, to grasp someone's ideas, and to try to walk a mile in their shoes, try to understand the problems that they're experiencing. And so, of course, this directly ties back into the sociological perspective, right? Trying to identify the strange and the familiar, and the sociological imagination, which really asks you to have empathy and verstehen, and to understand someone's view and to see how world events could be impacting someone. As he's studying individual, groups in our society, he also studies something called the ideal type. So, he's thinking about, these are the social problems that exist in terms of women's rights, African American lack of rights, things like that. And he says, what is the goal in terms of our society? What is the ideal type, and how close are we to achieving it? How far away are we? So yet again, continue to focus on how could we improve our world. And I think this is our last slide here. Yep, last slide. Other later influential sociologists, you've got Jane Addams. She opens Hull House in Chicago. She later receives the Nobel Peace Prize for some of her work in terms of charity work and helping others. She helps people who are immigrants from all walks of life. She's definitely more of a social worker than a sociologist, but she does go on to write many journals and pamphlets encouraging people to help the poor, to have empathy, to look at things from a different perspective, kind of embracing the sociological perspective, and trying to fix society's problems. Last one to talk about is W.E.B. Du Bois, and he was the first African American to earn a PhD at Harvard. He helped found the NAACP. We study him in U.S. history when we're talking about Booker T. Washington versus Du Bois after the Civil War in the late 1800s, how they're trying to improve America. He says the way that Americans are going to have better lives is not only through education, the way Booker T. Washington suggests, but he really says that new laws have to be created in America that treat people equally. He wants to end Jim Crow laws. He wants to punish people, who support legalized segregation in America, which is what those Jim Crow laws are. And he starts conducting experiments on race. He collects empirical data, and he tries to write papers, hold protests, have speeches. He meets with several presidents to try to bring about change, but he's not going to have a huge impact. But, he kind of specializes in race relations, just like Jane Addams kind of specializes in helping immigrants and the poor. So they each kind of have their own area. Some of the other people that we're going to be talking more about here include like C. Wright Mills, right, who created the sociological imagination, and George Herbert Mead, who creates symbolic interactionism. But these are really kind of the main sociologists here for Chapter 1 that we're going to be focusing on. If you've got any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.